"Security, check that invite. She doesn't belong here." They said it loud enough to bruise her pride, but Reese Lewis didn't argue. She let their arrogance speak first, because she knew what came next. The limo door still glistened behind her, her name already trending outside. Upstairs, the man signing their divorce papers would soon realize his greatest loss had just walked in wearing grace like armor. Stay with us. Because what began as dismissal ends in dominance. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever walked into a place they swore you'd never return to and owned it? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Stories Untold with Love, and ring that notification bell for more heartwarming stories that celebrate strength. The marble floors shimmered like glass beneath Reese Lewis's heels as she crossed the Clarendon hotel lobby, each step slow, measured, deliberate. The emerald silk of her gown followed behind her like a river of light, reflecting flashes of gold from the chandelier above. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Waiters froze mid-step. People turned their heads, whispering softly, their voices swallowed by the sound of piano music drifting from the bar. They remembered her. The woman who had once stood small and broken at that very door, her dignity cracking under the weight of public betrayal. Tonight, she did not look broken. She looked untouchable. Outside, the black limo still gleamed under the late afternoon sun, surrounded by photographers who shouted her name. Security guards moved like shadows, ushering them back. A camera crew lingered near the entrance, unsure if she had hired them or if they had simply sensed a story. Reese moved past them all without a glance, her chin high, her eyes calm. Her arrival had not been planned for spectacle. It was simply who she had become. The air carried her presence like perfume, cool and expensive and impossible to ignore. Behind the front desk, the hotel manager tried to smile, but his voice trembled as he greeted her. He remembered the night Orion Clark had arrived last year, his arm around another woman, the flash of camera lights, the whispers that followed Reese through the lobby as she left alone. He had thought she would never return, yet here she was, radiant, composed, walking toward the private elevator with a grace that silenced every room she passed. In the penthouse suite above, Orion stood before the window, with one hand resting against the glass. The city stretched out beneath him, its skyline bright and endless, but his eyes were fixed on the black car below. He could see the movement, the crowd, and then her. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, that she could not possibly walk through that same entrance again. But the crowd parted, and he saw the unmistakable sweep of emerald fabric. His chest tightened. He had prepared himself for this day, for signatures and polite conversation and the end of what had once been beautiful. What he had not prepared for was the way she still made the air leave his lungs. The elevator rose steadily toward him, and Orion turned away from the glass, forcing himself to focus. The documents were ready. His lawyer waited in the adjoining room, murmuring about settlements and shares. Yet the sound blurred around him. The past year had been a slow unraveling of control. He had built a company from nothing, but when it came to love, he had torn it apart with his own hands. Downstairs, Reese paused by the elevator doors. In her reflection, she saw a woman she barely recognized, stronger, quieter, whole. The last time she had entered this place, her heart had been breaking. This time, it was steady. The doors opened and she stepped inside, her reflection fading in the mirrors as the elevator began its ascent. By the time she reached the penthouse floor, Orion's pulse had turned unsteady. He heard the faint click of her heels long before the door opened. Somewhere below, the press waited for a photograph that would tell the world how it ended. Yet as Reese entered the suite, the light seemed to follow her. She carried no bitterness in her eyes, only the stillness of someone who had already survived the worst. And as Orion turned to face her, he realized something he had never expected to feel again: regret. The door closed softly behind Reese, sealing the world out. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the low hum of the city through the glass. Orion stood near the window, a silhouette against the skyline he had once ruled. His reflection looked foreign, a man sculpted from control yet hollowed by consequence. The charcoal fabric of his suit could not disguise the fatigue etched into his eyes. He had worn that look for months, long before today, long before he knew she would walk into this room again. Reese crossed the suite with slow precision, her heels striking the floor in an unbroken rhythm. She stopped a few feet from the table where two sets of papers waited, pristine and final. The emerald fabric of her dress caught the afternoon light, and for a moment Orion remembered how it once felt to trace that same color along her skin, how her laughter had filled this very room before it became a graveyard of unspoken words. She did not sit. She stood with the poise of someone who had already decided everything long ago. Her expression was composed, her hands steady. The faint smile on her lips carried no warmth, only civility. It was the kind of smile people used when the truth no longer needed to be spoken. Orion gestured toward the documents, a mechanical motion that felt beneath the weight of what stood between them. His lawyer cleared his throat, murmuring about clauses and percentages, but neither of them listened. Reese's gaze drifted toward the window, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the room. He wanted this done publicly. Now he had it. The cameras were waiting downstairs, the reporters eager for a statement, the story already written in headlines that spoke of power and betrayal. Orion watched her profile against the light, that calm grace that had once disarmed him. She had always been unafraid of silence, and now she used it like a weapon. Every heartbeat between them echoed with the things he should have said, the apologies left too long unspoken. He had traded intimacy for image, devotion for ambition, love for something that glittered and died just as fast. When she finally looked at him, it was not with anger. It was something heavier: pity. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again, like waves smoothing over broken glass. She reached for the pen, her movements fluid, deliberate. The sound of ink meeting paper was deafening. Orion felt the moment strike through him like truth. There were no raised voices, no tears, no collapse of decorum. Just the quiet certainty that she was gone in every way that mattered. The woman who had once waited for him to come home, who had believed in his brilliance even when it burned her, no longer existed. Reese set the pen down carefully and looked at him one last time. Her voice was soft but unyielding. He had wanted a show. Now he was standing in the ruins of it. Then she turned away, her gown whispering across the marble as she walked to the door. When the elevator closed behind her, Orion was still standing there, staring at the empty space where she had been. The papers lay between them, signed and silent, the proof that ambition had a cost he could never repay. The gallery had smelled of rain and varnish that night, a quiet corner of the city glowing under soft amber light. Reese moved between the canvases with gentle curiosity, her fingers clasped loosely in front of her, her attention drawn to a painting most people had ignored. The piece was rough, unfinished, a burst of color and emotion that seemed to pulse with life. She stood there for a long time, studying the flaws as if they held a secret. When Orion first saw her, she looked like part of the art itself. He had come to the gallery on invitation, another networking event disguised as culture. The room buzzed with quiet competition, investors murmuring about potential value and return. To him, art had always been a transaction. Yet something about the way she tilted her head toward that imperfect painting made him pause. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to feel something, He approached out of curiosity, his tailored suit sharp against the room's warmth. When he asked what she saw in the painting, she smiled faintly, not turning toward him. She said that real art didn't need to be perfect, it only needed to be honest. He had never heard anyone say it like that before. That night, he didn't leave with a new investment. He left with her number written on the back of a folded brochure. Their first dates were quiet, full of long walks and conversations that stretched into the night. She spoke about texture and light, and how the smallest crack in a sculpture could make it more human. He listened, intrigued by how easily she found meaning in what others dismissed. For a man who had spent his life chasing perfection, her softness felt like relief. When he built his first office, she hung one of her favorite paintings behind his desk. She said it reminded him of balance, though neither of them understood how much he would forget that. As his company grew, the dinners became shorter, the calls rarer. Reese adjusted at first, believing his long hours were temporary. She still left notes on his desk, gentle reminders to eat, small sketches tucked under his calendar. But slowly, the warmth of their life began to cool. The more success Orion gained, the more he looked at the world through numbers and forecasts, and the less he understood hers. The softness that once steadied him started to irritate him. He began to see her empathy as distraction, her compassion as indulgence. When she suggested he take a break, he accused her of not understanding what it meant to build something from nothing. When she tried to show him a new exhibition, he dismissed it as a waste of time. The man who once admired her courage to feel deeply now used it as a blade, cutting her down with measured indifference. One evening, she stood in the doorway of his office, the city lights behind her. He didn't look up from his laptop when she told him that love could not survive on apologies scheduled between meetings. He only nodded, half listening, already thinking about his next call. That was the night she stopped speaking softly. The night she learned that silence could be her greatest defense. The night the photographs surfaced, Reese was alone in their penthouse, surrounded by glass and silence. The city glittered beneath her like an ocean of noise she could no longer hear. On the television, muted reporters smiled as they replayed the footage. Orion Clark, the visionary billionaire, stepping out of a car with Nova Briggs on his arm. Cameras flashed as if celebrating a coronation. His hand rested on the small of Nova's back, the same place he once touched Reese in quiet affection. She watched the images loop until the screen blurred. Then she turned it off, her reflection staring back at her in the dark. For months, she had told herself it was business. Appearances. A man like Orion had obligations, alliances, investors to charm. She had believed his apologies, the late-night promises that came between board meetings and half-finished dinners. But even the strongest heart can only stretch so far before it starts to tear. The more power he gathered, the smaller she became in his world. He built skyscrapers out of ego and called them legacy. She built silence and called it survival. The breaking point did not come with shouting. It came in fragments, a missed anniversary, a charity gala where he arrived late, smelled of another woman's perfume, and introduced Reese as a dear friend instead of his wife. A conversation where she asked him what he wanted out of life, and he answered with profit margins. She realized then that she was no longer a partner. She was a prop. When Nova began appearing beside him in magazines, Reese did not confront him. There was no dramatic scene, no accusation. Instead, she went to her studio. She picked up a brush she had not touched in years and began to paint. The strokes were sharp, uneven, alive. The canvas bloomed with color and fury. By morning, she knew exactly what she needed to do. The next day, while Orion prepared for another investor summit, she packed quietly. No suitcase could hold the years they had shared, so she took only what was hers before him. A single photograph, her favorite painting, the letter he had once written when their love was new. She left the key on the marble counter and closed the door behind her. There was no note. He would understand the message in her absence far more clearly than in her words. When the tabloids speculated about the split, she did not respond. They called her the quiet wife, the forgotten muse, the woman left behind. They were wrong. Reese was already rebuilding, piece by piece, in a small gallery downtown. She poured every betrayal into color and light, transforming humiliation into art that spoke without bitterness. The world began to notice. Within a year, her foundation opened its doors, offering opportunities to young artists who had been overlooked, just as she once had. Orion's name was carved on buildings. Hers was whispered in rooms filled with truth. The woman he had dismissed as too small for his world was now shaping one of her own. And though her hands still trembled some nights, it was not from heartbreak. It was from creation, the kind that comes after destruction, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. The conference room was a cathedral of glass and tension. Cameras flashed from behind closed doors as reporters waited for a glimpse of the woman who had become a mystery turned movement. Reese sat at the far end of the long oak table, her posture flawless, her presence unshakable. The woman once described as fragile was now a force wrapped in silk. The curve of her hand around the pen looked deliberate, ceremonial. Every movement was quiet power. Across from her, Orion sat surrounded by lawyers and advisors who whispered strategies in low voices. The man who had once commanded rooms with a glance now seemed smaller in the shadow of his own mistakes. His empire was cracking under investigation. Numbers that once defined his success were now the evidence of his downfall. He kept his gaze fixed on the documents, unable to look at the woman who no longer needed him. The lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. The papers slid across the polished surface, landing in front of Reese. Her name looked strange beside his, as if they had never belonged together. She had spent years learning how to sign contracts for galleries, foundations, partnerships. This was different. This was release, the end of a story written in devotion and rewritten in strength. She reached for the pen, her fingers steady. Her lawyer spoke her name, the one the media had resurrected from scandal and turned into legend. The woman who rebuilt herself while the world watched in disbelief. Reese Lewis Clark. She hesitated only for a breath, not from doubt, but to honor the version of herself who had once believed love was enough. Then she signed. The sound of ink gliding across paper was final and liberating. No one in the room dared to speak. Even Orion's legal team seemed unsure whether to congratulate or offer condolences. When Reese finished, she placed the pen down gently and lifted her eyes. They met Orion's for the first time that day. There was no anger there, no longing, only truth. She had forgiven him the way people forgive storms, by learning how to stand after they pass. Outside, a camera clicked. Through the glass walls, the city's reflection shimmered like a painting in motion. Reporters would soon write about her poise, her grace, the black limo that symbolized victory, but none of them would understand that she had not come to win. She had come to close a door and walk away without looking back. Orion tried to find his voice, but it failed him. The woman who had once needed his approval now existed in a world where his opinion carried no weight. Her name, her work, her silence, all of it was untouchable. He had built an empire of stone, but she had built one of spirit, and spirit lasts longer. Reese stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress as if brushing off the last trace of him. The lawyers gathered the papers in silence. She thanked her counsel with a calm nod, then turned toward the exit. The door opened and light poured in. As she stepped through, the murmurs of admiration began again. This time, they weren't about who she was married to. They were about who she had become. The room was still thick with the echo of footsteps as the last camera crew filed out. The air smelled faintly of perfume and paper, the kind of sterile quiet that comes after spectacle. Reese stood by the window, watching the city move far below, her reflection a faint shimmer against the glass. Behind her, Orion shifted in his chair, the scrape of metal against marble breaking the silence. He had rehearsed 1,000 speeches, but none of them seemed to fit the moment. His voice, once commanding, came out softer than he intended as he asked if this had all been for revenge. Reese turned, the movement slow and deliberate. Her expression was not cruel. It was something deeper, older, a tired kind of clarity. She studied him for a long moment before speaking, as if weighing whether the truth would even matter anymore. When she finally answered, her tone carried no venom. She said it was never about revenge. It was about truth finally catching up to him. The calm in her voice cut sharper than anger ever could. She took a step closer, her heels echoing against the floor. She told him about the nights she had spent lying awake beside a man who was already gone, how she had looked for herself in his indifference and found only shadows. She told him about the humiliation of smiling for cameras while knowing the world whispered behind her back, about learning to hold her head high even when it felt too heavy to lift. Every word was steady, each one landing with precision. Orion tried to speak, but she didn't give him the chance. She said she had learned something important in the silence he left her with. That healing did not mean pretending nothing happened. It meant accepting that she could never go back to who she was before him. She had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. He had mistaken her grace for weakness. He was about to learn what it really was. Her gaze softened, but her words did not. She told him she didn't need to destroy him. He had done that himself. The empire he built had been strong enough to intimidate governments, but too fragile to survive truth. His pride had been his undoing long before she walked away. Now, the man who had once believed he could buy his way out of anything was facing the one thing he could not negotiate: accountability. For the first time, Orion had no words. His throat felt dry, his hands tense around the armrest of his chair. She looked at him one last time, her eyes neither cruel nor forgiving, only certain. He realized then that she was not the woman he had left behind. She was the lesson he had refused to learn. Reese turned back to the window, the afternoon light outlining her figure like a painting framed in gold. She didn't need to walk out this time to prove she was free. The silence between them already said everything. When she finally left, the door closed softly, but its echo lingered long after she was gone, a reminder that some losses are too complete to recover from. The city outside the Clarendon was a blur of wet light and reflection, each raindrop bending the glow of street lamps into trembling halos. Reese stood beneath the golden awning, the hem of her gown brushing against the marble, her umbrella unopened in her hand. The storm did not touch her. For the first time in years, she felt untouchable. Behind her, the last of the guests drifted out, murmuring in low voices, curious glances following the woman who had turned a divorce into an act of grace. Her driver waited at the curb, engine running, but she hesitated for a moment, breathing in the cool air that carried the faint scent of jasmine and asphalt. Then she heard him, the sound of shoes on wet stone, quick and uneven. Orion's voice cut through the rain, raw and unguarded. He had removed his jacket, his tie hung loose, and the storm had already begun to soak through his shirt. The perfect image of the man the world once worshipped was gone, replaced by something smaller, human, desperate. He said her name once, and she turned slowly, her eyes calm beneath the shimmer of streetlight. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The space between them felt like all the years they had lost, condensed into a single breath. When he finally tried to speak, his voice trembled. He began to tell her that he never stopped feeling, never stopped loving, but the words sounded fragile against the rain. She looked at him, her expression soft but resolute. Love, she said quietly, was never the problem. Respect was. The difference between the two was what had broken them. The rain grew heavier, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. He took a step closer, but she did not move. He searched her face for the tenderness he once knew, but what he found was peace, the kind that comes only after letting go. His hand twitched as if to reach for her, but he stopped himself. She had already forgiven him. That was the cruelest kind of mercy. Reese's driver approached with an umbrella, opening the car door. The limo's interior glowed softly, warm and inviting, a sanctuary from the storm. She turned once more toward Orion, her voice barely above the sound of rain. He had once asked her what it meant to love something completely. Now he was standing in the answer. It meant knowing when to stop holding on. He tried to speak again, but the words dissolved before they reached her. She gave him a final look that was neither goodbye nor farewell, only acknowledgement of what they had been and what they would never be again. Then she stepped into the car, her gown trailing behind her like a memory. The door closed with a quiet finality that sounded like the end of a song. Orion stood in the rain, watching the limo glide away into the blur of city lights. The reflection of its taillights stretched across the wet pavement like a fading heartbeat. When it disappeared around the corner, he was left alone under the same awning where she had once waited for him to come home. This time, she didn't look back. The weeks unfolded like slow rain, steady and without mercy. Headlines no longer spoke his name with admiration but with curiosity, as if trying to understand how a man could lose everything without ever noticing it slip away. The investigation into his company deepened, and though the damage was contained, the silence in his life grew louder. Orion moved through his days as if performing a script he no longer believed in, each meeting an echo of who he used to be. Success, once intoxicating, now tasted metallic. Every room felt too large, every conversation too empty. Meanwhile, the world could not stop talking about her. Reese Lewis, the woman who rebuilt herself with elegance and fire, had become more than a name. She was a symbol. Magazines called her a force of grace, the living portrait of resilience. Her foundation flourished, her exhibits sold out, her voice began to appear in interviews where she spoke about art and healing. Never about him. That silence stung more than any accusation could have. On a quiet evening, Orion found himself standing outside one of her exhibitions. The building was modest but glowing, every window alive with soft amber light. He told himself he was there for closure, though even he didn't believe it. The crowd inside moved slowly, reverently, drawn into the stories painted on the walls. He kept to the edges, unnoticed, his collar turned up as if hiding from his own reflection. Then he saw it. The painting stood alone at the end of the gallery, larger than the rest, framed in gold that caught the light like fire. Its title, etched discreetly on a small plaque, read, "The Woman Who Walked Away." He stepped closer, and the air seemed to shift. The painting was not loud or vengeful. It was quiet, deliberate, filled with soft colors that collided in perfect harmony. The woman in it stood at the edge of a storm, her back to the chaos, her face turned toward the horizon. There was no sorrow in her expression, only release. He looked longer, his pulse unsteady. In the reflection of the glass, his own face appeared beside hers, pale and tired, and he saw himself for the first time, without defense. The man who had traded love for legacy. The man who measured worth in applause and found himself clapping alone. He had thought his empire was the masterpiece. Now he realized it had always been her. A curator approached quietly, speaking about how the piece had been inspired by transformation, by the courage to choose peace over pride. Orion listened, though the words blurred into something far more personal. He understood that this was not a portrait of loss. It was a mirror of rebirth. When he left the gallery, the night air felt sharp and alive. The city lights shimmered against the pavement, but for the first time in years, he looked up instead of ahead. Somewhere behind him, people stood in awe of her art, her story, her strength. He walked into the darkness, knowing that while the world saw her as the woman who walked away, he would always remember her as the woman who taught him how to see. The letter took him 3 days to write and only a minute to send. The words came slowly, heavy with the weight of years unspoken. It was not a plea or a confession. It was the truth, stripped of pretense. He told her that power without grace was emptiness, and that he had lived long enough inside that void to know its cost. He wrote that she had been the light that showed him what real strength looked like. When he signed his name, his hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. There was no expectation of reply, only the hope that his apology would reach her heart the way her silence had reached his. Days passed, then weeks. The world went on with its noise, its headlines, its distractions. He focused on rebuilding not his empire but himself. The offices felt different now. He spent more time listening, less time commanding. He walked instead of sending drivers. He began donating quietly, anonymously, to programs that helped others rise from the kind of fall he once believed only happened to other people. One morning, an envelope arrived. It wasn't a letter, but an invitation embossed with gold lettering. The Reese Lewis Foundation was hosting an event for children in the arts, celebrating creativity and opportunity. There was no personal note, no mention of his letter. But at the bottom of the page, in neat handwriting, were 3 words. "If you wish." He went, not as the man he once was, but as someone learning what humility felt like. The venue was an old theater transformed into a sanctuary of color and laughter. Paintings done by children lined the walls, bright and imperfect, alive with joy. The hum of conversation was light, free from the stiffness of wealth and status. He moved quietly among the guests, unnoticed, watching her from a distance. Reese stood on stage addressing the crowd, her voice calm and full of conviction. She spoke about art as a language that heals, about how beauty can grow from what was once broken. The audience listened intently, but Orion was transfixed. She had never looked more alive. The light caught her face, and he saw it. The same fire that once drew him in, now belonging entirely to her. She wasn't speaking for approval anymore. She was speaking from purpose. Children gathered around her after the speech, clutching small brushes and art supplies. She bent to their level, smiling, laughing softly as they spoke. The tenderness in her gestures made something ache inside him. It was not longing. It was admiration, the kind that expects nothing in return. When she finally looked across the room and found him standing in the back, their eyes met. No one else noticed the small acknowledgement that passed between them. She didn't smile, but her gaze held warmth, acceptance, and an ending that didn't need words. As the event continued, Orion slipped out quietly. The night air was cool, the sky painted in soft shades of dusk. For the first time in years, he smiled, not because he had won anything, but because he had finally learned to let something beautiful exist without owning it. Paris shimmered beneath a veil of evening light, the Seine reflecting 1,000 fractured stars. The crowd outside the Musée de l'Orangerie pressed close to the velvet ropes, their anticipation humming like electricity. Black cars arrived one by one, each releasing figures draped in couture and confidence. But when Reese stepped out of her limo, the world seemed to pause. The cameras flared white-hot, their flashes turning the air to light. She moved with the quiet assurance of someone who no longer needed to prove she belonged. The emerald dress had been replaced by silver, soft and fluid, catching the glow of the city with every step. She greeted reporters with calm smiles and brief nods, her answers graceful, measured. They asked about her exhibit, about her rise, about the meaning behind her latest collection. Not one mentioned her past, not one said his name. That omission was its own kind of reverence. She had become more than the story that once defined her. Inside, the museum was transformed into a dream of color and reflection. The exhibition, titled Becoming Light, was a study of transformation. Each canvas told a story of emergence, the slow journey from darkness into grace. Reese walked among them, greeting patrons, collectors, and students from her foundation who had flown in just to witness the moment. The air was thick with admiration and quiet awe. Her voice, when she spoke to them, carried both strength and softness. The balance she had once been told was impossible. Across the ocean, in an apartment overlooking the Hudson, Orion watched the coverage unfold on his television. The reporters spoke her name with respect now, their tone reverent. He muted the sound and simply watched her move, the way she held herself, the ease in her expression. His hand rested on the letter she had returned to him months earlier, creased at the edges, marked by travel. She had written only 3 words in reply to his apology: "Keep becoming." He had kept it on his desk ever since, a compass for the man he was trying to be. In Paris, Reese stepped onto the small stage at the center of the gallery, her face illuminated by golden light. The crowd quieted as she began to speak, her voice steady but full of emotion. She talked about pain as a teacher, about loss as the first sketch of reinvention. Healing, she said, was the most beautiful art form there is. The words lingered in the stillness, and then came the applause, steady, rising, filling the room like a tide. She stood for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. The faces in front of her blurred into light, into gratitude. For the first time, she felt no need to look back. The life behind her had been a lesson, not a cage. As the applause swelled higher, she smiled, not for the cameras, but for herself. Outside, Paris glittered. Somewhere far away, a man who had once lost everything closed his eyes and whispered a quiet thank you. And in that unspoken exchange between 2 souls who had finally learned to let go, the story found its ending. Not in tragedy, not in victory, but in peace. If this story spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone needs to know that being underestimated is not the end. It's the opening act of becoming unforgettable. Comment below if you've ever been the one they counted out, until the moment you walked in and changed everything. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.